You know, there's a dirty joke to be said here, but I'm above that. No, I'm not. At least take him to dinner first. Hello everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, helping you decide, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. Today's book is The Coming of Draggin. The Coming of Dragons by A.J. Lake. The Coming of Dragons is the first book of the Darkest Age trilogy and was written by A.J. Lake, published on May 1st, 2006. Obviously, due to the fact that it's a trilogy, it has two sequels, that of which being the Book of Swords and the conclusion to the trilogy, the Book of Stone. Apart from that, I couldn't necessarily find much else to talk about in terms of background for this book, so I'm just going to dive into the report card from here and move on. So, report card. Let's start with the review, and we start what we always do, the cover. Now, the cover on this is I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not necessarily good either. You have what looks like a mostly blank background with black and dark blue, while the main title of the book and the author's name is directly on the front, in a silver lettering that glistens with light. Then you have the fact that it's, the Darkest Age, book 1 here at the top, and the Darkest Age begins down there at the bottom, along with a small little, I guess, kind of likeness of a dragon, but more in it was made for a brooch style than anything else. Now, the problem I have with this cover is that the black kind of washes most of this stuff out. The dark colors wash most of what's in the background out. I actually had to sit here and look at it to realize that this isn't a blank background or like a small modeling of colors. This is actually supposed to be a sky covered with dark clouds. In addition, if you're not up close, you can't make out this background here that the Darkest Age Book 1 part of this is supposed to sit on, making it stand out a little better. It just kind of blends so well into the background that you kind of wonder what the point of it was. The back is just an excerpt from the book. It happens so fairly early in the book that I'm not sure why they decided to put an excerpt in. So this one, at least, I mean, I could understand a couple things later on in the book, but this doesn't really. The point of doing this kind of thing is to get you excited for what's going to come. However, within the first 20 pages, you've already read this part, so. And to be completely honest, it's not a terribly interesting quote. It's actually kind of misleading, but I'm going to get into that later. Apart from that, it's just got that dragon brooch style on there again. Now, being a dust cover, the inside pockets have the synopsis and the small about the author section, where we get very minimal detail on the author, even in comparison to the normal amount you get with these things. So, with that, we'll mostly move on. The synopsis. Now, the synopsis of this book is that basically a young boy named Edmund, who is the Prince of Sussex, is attempting to flee to Gaul with his uncle as the Danish raiders, the Vikings basically, are coming to their shores. His father's out fighting them, but they haven't heard from his father in months now, and his mother fears that he's been lost. So she sends Edmund out to basically preserve the bloodline while she stays behind to defend their land. While on the trip back, his ship is attacked by a massive dragon, which proceeds to sink it, leaving only him and the captain's daughter, a girl named Elspeth. Elspeth, I think that's how you pronounce it. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Elspeth as the only survivors of the shipwreck, at least as far as they know. I'm not putting it past the book to do a twist reveal later on in the other books, but however, that's not the end of it. After they're saved by an old man named Agard, they discover that they're both destined for greatness. Edmund is revealed to be a part of a powerful class of people known as repentants. Repentes. I'll put it down below. Again, I don't know how to say it, but I'll go into that more. But basically, this is a class of people that are capable of seeing not only through another person's eyes, but hearing their thoughts in that moment as well. This doesn't just mean people, this also means animals. Elspeth, however, while not born, special, manages to accidentally bond with a magical crystal sword, which marks her as the knight, so to speak, that will eventually fight and slay the dragon and or something much greater in the future. It's one of those, I'll get a little more into it later, but for now that's what I'm going to leave it at. From there, they decide that they're going to flee to Gaul over land, since the dragon will be hunting them at sea, I guess. And throughout that, they come across several things, while trying to avoid an evil sorcerer and fellow repete named Orgrim, who has convinced King Botrick, the King of Sussex, that he is a trusted advisor that must be listened to because everyone is always plotting against him. And with that, we'll move on. That is basically all you need for the synopsis. With the synopsis out of the way, let's get into the book proper. Let's talk about this book. And let's start with something real simple. The world building on this book is poor. Now, this book tries to be a sort of Arthurian fantasy kind of book, set in the real world with low fantasy elements that create an epic adventure, basically. However, apart from general lip service, it doesn't really use the Arthurian style very well at all. Apart from it being set in the real world, it just sort of feels like the generic fantasy land. Nothing is really explored in the lands. Cultures aren't talked about. For the most part, you rarely get descriptions unless it's an area where you're going to be in for a while. Like, I vaguely recall the capital of Sussex being described and a couple of other smaller places. But apart from that, you basically are just kind of imagining a generic field, a generic forest path as you go through this book. But that's a small minor complaint. The bigger one is more that the lore of the world itself kind of clashes. The biggest one that I'm going to point out to in this case is the Ripente. God, I don't know how to say that. The Ripente that Edmund is. Now, when Edmund hears about this, the first thing that he tells us is that he doesn't want to be a Ripente because Ripentes are known as scoundrels and blackguards at the best of times, using their ability mostly only to benefit themselves, and how tales exist of how dangerous and self-serving they are. And then when Elspeth learns this, learns that Edmund's a Ripente as well, she has the same reaction. Those are her first thoughts as well. So, and we even get told by Minstrel, a traveling storyteller, that is the common perception of the Ripentes throughout the world. So, to put a fine emphasis on this point, a storyteller who's responsible for spreading tales, a prince, and a sailor all have the same exact perception of what a Ripente is, showing that all walks of life have this negative view of them. So it doesn't make any sense how Orgrim, our main antagonist, is able to use his Ripente powers to become the trusted advisor of King Botrick. And mind you, he became the trusted advisor despite those powers. He became the trusted advisor because of those powers. This is flat out told to us that the only reason King Botrick trusts him as much as he does is because he is a Ripente. He can say, I've seen through their eyes and heard their thoughts. I know what they're thinking. And it isn't like Orgrim is playing on an already paranoid king, because once Orgrim is removed from the equation and they discuss with the king as well, or even while Orgrim is alive and people are appealing to King Botrick's better senses, King Botrick shows himself to be a reasonable man, only to be swayed at the last second by Orgrim's Ripente powers. Basically saying, I've seen through their eyes. They came here to kill you. kind of like a non-magical corrupting version of Wormtooth with Theoden. Oh my god. I am not having good times with names today. Theoden from Lord of the Rings.
My lord, Gandalf the Grey is coming. He's a herald of woe. He's not welcome.
There's no magic involved, so it doesn't make sense why he's so unquestioningly listening to this being that's obviously untrustworthy. But at the same time, it's just one of those, it violates the law of your world by itself. So on one hand, you're saying Ripentays are considered scoundrels and blackguards by everyone. Oh, but here's a king who's literally giving the guy the utmost face because of his Ripentay powers. And I guess this sort of ties into my next point. One of the points that is established is it kind of falls into the world building, but it's also another point outside of that is that the things that are set up are very rarely utilized within this book. Edmund's Ripentay powers, which is what brings me to this point. For example, he barely uses when they would be convenient for him to basically use to spy on someone he doesn't trust or to look around and explore something that would be a danger to go in normally. I mean, he uses it on occasion, but never when it seems to make the most sense to use it. For example, the minstrel that they travel with, neither of them trust very much and has been known to slip off during the night. And several times they say, I wonder where he goes. Okay, are we sure we can trust him? But never once does Edmund try to look through his eyes. Never once does Edmund try to look through the eyes of the people chasing them. He never tries to look through the eyes of other folks. He uses his powers to hunt boars, swindle a swindler, basically one of those cup guys, who is skilled but also cheats to scam people out of their money. And then at the last point, when it's actually relevant to the plot, where he fights Orgrim, their fellow Ripentay, with his Ripentay powers. Kind of like, a psychic battle between the two. And it's just one of those that's just so rarely used. You kind of wonder why he's a Ripentay at points. But maybe that'll pop up further in the future. Maybe we can just excuse this to him not being very, versed with his powers, and he's still kind of working it out, even though at a certain point he says ever since he's done this, it's super easy to do it. Not the point. But that's not the only case of it. The dragon, this whole book, the coming of dragons, the dragon that's on the front, on the back, the dragon that's mentioned in the excerpt here to get you excited for the book and the thing. That dragon pops up in the first chapter and the last chapter, and that's it. Like, there's this big point of showing that dragons are coming back. This Orgrim has summoned a dragon and it's dangerous. And they do mention him from occasionally, but there was such a long stretch where we had not heard from the dragon, they had not discussed the dragon, you didn't even see any of the dragon's effects on the land after being summoned, that I completely forgot there was a dragon in this book until they mentioned, oh hey, remember that dragon? Oh, that's right, a dragon! If you're gonna call your book The Coming of Dragons, you should probably put a little more emphasis on the dragon in the book, right? The dragon feels like it's there to set up other books, not to talk about, not to be a star of the book itself. That's mostly put down to Orgrim, who is kind of his summoner, but in the end it's kind of revealed, oh wait, did he really summon the dragon? Again, it's just one of those, it's not utilized to the effectiveness that it could be utilized. It really isn't helped by how this book is written. This book isn't written in a way that's engaging to read. Like when you put your clothes in the washer, you can toss, a red shirt, a black shirt, a blue shirt, and, 2 or 3 dark gray shirts in there. And while they're sitting there not moving, okay, you can pick out their fellow shirts that you've thrown in. Like, okay, that one's the red one, that's the blue one, those are the gray ones. And, you can pick them all out while nothing's happening. But the moment you start reading or you turn on the washer, it's like it instantly hits the high spin cycle. Everything moves at such a pace that it just spins so fast that you can't really make anything out. It's almost dizzying to watch. In fact, it's dizzying to read. And it gets to the point where it's just, there are times when we'll go from one set piece to another, to another, to another in the span of 2 pages. And each time it sets up like the set piece is going to be important, only to jump to the next set piece. Again, giving a very dizzying effect, like you're in a washer on the high spin cycle. And despite that description being very apt, the book is still slow somehow. Now, the reason... Now, okay, take a look at this book. You see its size, see how big it is. Not very thick, right? Not very tall. You would think this book, okay, it's got to have fast pacing. It doesn't have a lot of time to work, so it needs to get what it needs done very fast. After all, I mean, not like it's written in tiny text either. Like it would be if you were, say, reading this. Where it's small, yes, but the text is a lot smaller as well. No, in this case, it feels like this book was originally written for something this size. See the difference? It feels like... It feels like this book was originally meant to be this size. And because of that, it moves very slowly at first. And then like somewhere a little over halfway through, the author suddenly realized, oh, my book is going to be over in like 60 pages. I need to speed this up. Because like 100 pages in, this book is only about 220 something pages. And we're talking at 140, 160 pages in, our characters are still like in the, to use a RPG game equivalent, they're still in the starting area taking a side quest to hunt boars. While as 2 missions later on the main quest, the big bad guy who's trying to destroy the world and is currently, again, in narrative, summoning hordes of, evil monsters to lay waste to the land, is in the process of doing that. But they're over there, they're in the starting area slaying boars, where, by the logic of the game, there's nothing there yet. Because that's supposed to be calm, peaceful area to introduce you to the world. I.e., this is the calm, peaceful area introducing us to this world. We get this boar hunt because we're supposed to be shown that Edmund and Elspeth are righteous people who are trying to save people from vindictive response by the Orgrim, who's punishing them because they wouldn't tell him where the guy he was hunting went. So yeah, it's just one of those, it's very slow. It definitely feels like it was written for a much larger book, and then halfway through they decided to just cut it down. Because, and that's not just me, I'm not just making that assumption based on the flow of the book and how big it is. I'm making that assumption based on a couple things within the book as well. Like, there's a couple things that are set up like they're going to be this big set piece within the book. You're going to spend a few chapters here learning about something or dealing with a current threat here, only for the book to just kind of... And then they walk through that area. On to the next part. One such example is when they're traveling through a small valley and end up in an old ruined temple. Now, the pursuers, a group called the Guardians, comes up just behind them and looks like it's about to catch them. So Elspeth, in a moment of wit, cuts down the entrance with a magical sword, which can cut through anything from stone to metal, and collapses the entrance, trapping the Guardians outside, but them inside. So the only way out is to go through this tunnel. Now, as they're going through this tunnel, their minstrel guide, who is very clearly a little on edge, he makes them go into a specific pattern as they travel through this underground tunnel, and specifically says we shouldn't be here, and the dwellers under the hill can be unforgiving. Now, in context, this sounds like the book is setting up that they're going to run into a tribe of, let's say, goblins. Goblins feels the most appropriate here. That they're going to have to deal with and showcase, an expansion of their powers, how they've evolved as people. No. After he says that, you get about 2 paragraphs of them traveling, and then they come out the other side. Basically meaning that you could have cut this whole comment that he makes, and you would lose absolutely nothing because the comment isn't there for any reason. It's not setting anything up. It's a failed Chekhov's gunman. It's a failed Chekhov's gun. It set something up, but never delivered on it. And there's more than one scene in here like that. more than one scene that seems like it's building up to something gonna happen in this area, just for the author to be like, and then they walk through with no problem. And it's just one of those, it feels like one of those movies where they're trying to cut it down to reach a certain runtime, but they don't cut out everything within the movie, so you clearly still see parts of the movie that were going to be much bigger as part of the movie, but they're like a footnote now. And it's just one of those, really? Like I said, it's hard to ignore that, where the book is a very slow narrative, but is also spinning so fast that it's dizzying. I know that sounds so oxymoronic, but that's really the best way to describe this book. And I think one of the biggest issues with this book is that there's just nothing that attaches you to it. This book is one of those books, I know some of you will know what I'm talking about when I say this, but it's one of those books that while you're reading it, there's nothing bad about it. You think, as you're reading it, or, this isn't bad. I don't know why I don't like this. This isn't bad. I mean, I don't see why people don't like this. So you read a few chapters, you close the book, put it down, and go off to do something. And then you promptly forget the book exists. The book doesn't keep you attached to it. I never felt a strong desire to pick this book back up after I set it down. Or really to just sit. I never felt a strong desire, I need to know what happens at the end. I need to finish this book. I was just kind of reading this book to read it at a certain point. And I know I've mentioned a book like this before, back with my Magic Kingdom for Sale review. How I talked about how I tried to read the sequel to that book, The Black Unicorn. But I got about 50 pages in, put it down, and promptly forgot it existed for about 2 weeks before I accidentally stumbled on the book again and realized, oh yeah, I was reading that book. So it is definitely one of those books. It's one of those, it doesn't try to keep you with it. It just like, come back or don't. I don't give a care. But yeah, that's like, in the end, it's not a terrible book for me, personally, but I do have to give it a 4 out of 10. Not starting the year off great with this book, it seems, but ultimately it's just a bland, generic fantasy book that doesn't do enough to distinguish itself, but also isn't fun in that generic, bland kind of sense. Like, if this had leaned way more into the Arthurian fantasy angle, it would have been interesting. Or if it had just tried to create its own world, instead of relying on the world that already was. In a sense, that almost felt like it was a crutch it was just something the author was familiar with, and that's why they decided to do it. Not because it served the story. Also, something I didn't mention in my review, but I'm going to mention here, blackface. This story has the equivalent of fantasy blackface, and I don't know how to feel about that. On one hand, it serves a point in the story about disguising someone by making their skin and hair darker, so they can't be found. On the other hand, we're in England, and he's putting on blackface, which to me feels like it would make him stand out more than it would be disguising him. So, you make of that what you will, but like I said, it feels like a badly edited movie. Something where it was clearly meant to be larger or something different, but somewhere from when it was filmed and when it was released, someone got in there with an editing tool and snipped off huge bits of it, which made it far less interesting than in the final product. Honestly, I'm not sure I would personally recommend this book to anyone. Maybe if you have a kid who's looking for some generic bland fantasy, but other than that, no. And to be perfectly honest with you, because I don't know who would enjoy it, and because I don't think this book offers anything worth reading, the question of whether or not it goes into Mount Doom is yes. Again, there's nothing worth reading in this book. And maybe the sequels will change that. Maybe the sequels have something much more investing or much more interesting that would make me see this book much more favorably. But as it stands at the moment, there is really no reason to read this book, because it's just such a generic, bland Arthurian fantasy that I could say just read anything else and you would probably have a better experience. I hope things get better with the next book. But then again, some skullduggery always makes me feel pretty pleasant. But until then, remember, With every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones.